The double bucker roller kit arrives with 2 drive rollers mounted on shafts with flange bearings, complete with coupler hubs, and follow rollers mounted on shafts with the take-up bearings slid onto the shafts. Before you start working on the machine, make sure that you disconnect it from power. Make sure that the machine is thoroughly cleaned to ensure proper installation of all parts. Remove both hoods from the double bucker and set them aside. Remove the rear motor guard from the machine. For the purposes of this video, we will be removing the rollers from one bucker head. We will simply repeat this process for the other side. Using a 5/16 hex wrench, loosen both of the roller tension bolts. Make certain not to adjust the nuts while removing the force caps. Using a 5/16 hex wrench, remove the 2 force caps on the top of the machine. Thread the bolts back into the force caps and make sure that the flat washer stays on the roller tension bolt. Set these parts aside. You will need them for reinstallation. Using a T30 Torx wrench, remove both bearing collars from the follow roller. To facilitate the removal of the follow roller, apply some food-grade grease to the side plates. From time to time, the follow roller can be stubborn to remove. Feel free to stand on the frame to apply extra pressure while pulling up on the follow roller. If you still can't remove the follow roller, consult the tips and tricks section at the end of this video for another method of removing it. Using a 3/32 hex wrench, remove the 4 bolts on the die plate. Set the die plate and the 4 bolts aside for reinstallation later. Using a T30 Torx wrench, remove both bearing collars from the drive roller bearings. Using a 2.5mm hex wrench, remove the 2 screws associated with the black coupler ring. Move the coupler element ring towards the motor and hang it on the shaft. You will need to leave this ring there the entire time before you reinstall the roller so that it's in place for recoupling. Remove the flex element from the coupler. Using a 3/8 inch hex on a socket wrench, remove the 4 bolts from the 2 lower drive roller bearings. Remove entirely the outer bearing. Slide the inner bearing over on the shaft to aid in removal of the roller. Remove the lower roller. Please note that both the take-up bearing and the flange bearings articulate within their respective housings. You can use a dead blow hammer to realign the bearing square to the shaft. To make it easier to install the drive roller, remove the outer bearing. Right. Slide the outer flange bearing onto the shaft. Make sure that the grease zerk is on top of the bearing and then hand thread each one of the bearing bolts into the frame to avoid cross-threading. For the inbound bearing, ensure that the grease zerk points towards the back of the machine. Using a 3/8 hex on a socket wrench, secure all 4 bolts on the flange bearings, crank them tight. With the bearing collars on both flange bearings either loose or removed, the shaft easily slides. The goal is to have 2 millimeters of spacing between the coupler hubs. To center the drive roller in the bucker head, you can measure from the outside of the roller to the inside of the side plate. Now that the drive roller has been centered in the bucker head, it's time to check for proper hub spacing. The proper distance between the 2 coupler hubs is 2 millimeters. We've found that 2 credit cards placed face to face is a perfect measuring tool for this task. If you are unable to reasonably center the roller within the bucker head and achieve a 2 millimeter distance between the coupler hubs, you'll need to slide the bucker head on the frame. In order to slide the bucker head on the frame, you'll need to loosen the 2 bolts up underneath the bucker head where it attaches to the frame. You do not need to remove these bolts entirely, only back the pressure off enough to where the bucker head slides on the frame. Here we've got an example of a side plate and a mount bracket to show you how the system works. The bolt from underneath simply applies pressure to a block of metal that applies pressure to the frame. When you have achieved proper spacing, you'll need to re-secure the bucker head via the mount brackets. These two bolts will need to be torqued to 13 foot-pounds, and you'll need to use Loctite 243 when you're reinstalling them. If you don't have a torque wrench, be cautious not to over-tighten these bolts. With the roller centered and 2mm spacing on the coupler hubs, it's time to lock down the roller on the shaft. Using Loctite 243 and a Torx T30 wrench, you're going to secure the bearing collars onto the inbound roller. For the outer flange bearing, you need to make sure that the bolt head sits on top of the bearing collar and points towards the back of the machine. Again, apply a drop of Loctite 243 and hand tighten with a Torx T30 wrench. Ensure that the bearing collar is fully seated against the bearing. To achieve this, apply significant pressure with the opposite hand that the wrench is in while you're securing the bolt. Torque each bearing collar to 160 inch-pounds. Now it's time to install the follow roller. Apply food-grade grease to both the side plates, where the take-up bearings will slide in, and the rubber take-up bushings on the take-up bearings. Proper orientation of the take-up bearing is when the grease zerk is on the bottom and the big holes on top. With the bearing collars removed from each of the take-up bearings and the take-up bearings sitting square to the shaft, you can easily insert the roller into the bucker head. Now it's time to center the follow roller within the bucker head. To achieve this, simply line up the outsides of the follow roller with the outsides of the drive roller. Using your hand, you can push the shaft back and forth since the bearing collars have not been installed yet. If this is difficult, resist the urge to strike the end of the shaft with a hammer, which can damage it. To install the bearing collars on the drive roller, apply a drop of Loctite 243 to each one of the bolts. Proper orientation of the bearing collars is when the bolt is on top and the bolt head is facing towards the back of the machine. When installing the bearing collars, it's very important to apply pressure to the bearing collar to make sure that it's fully seated against the bearing while you're hand tightening the bolt with a T30 Torx wrench. With your hand, give the rollers a spin and look at each bearing collar as they rotate. If you notice any wobbling, reinstall the bearing collar so that it's fully seated on the bearing. Torque each bearing collar to 160 inch-pounds. Clean off the excess grease. Now it's time to install the force caps. Orientation of the force caps is critical. You'll want to ensure that the holes associated with the thumb screws are pointing towards the front of the machine, and that the threads on each one of the force caps holes are pointed towards the inside. Also, don't forget, you need to make sure that the washers are sitting on the bottom of the bolts. To avoid cross-threading, get the bolts started by hand. Using a 5/16 hex wrench, crank down the pressure on each of the 4 bolts associated with the 2 force caps. Nice. Using a 5/16 hex wrench, tighten down the 2 roller tension bolts until the lock washer is completely flat. To measure the roller tension on your machine, you'll be measuring from the top of the drive roller shaft to the top of the follow roller shaft. This is an incredibly important measurement. If your rollers are too loose, it'll cause the machine to slip on the stems and harvest efficiency will suffer. If the rollers are too tight, damage can occur to your new rollers. Again, proper roller tension is critical. Pay attention. The roller tension bolts fully seated, the measurement from top of shaft to top of shaft will be 5.8 inches. If you don't have digital calipers, a tape measure will do, but be as accurate as possible. The measurement from top of shaft to top of shaft will be 5 13/16. It's critically important that both sides of the bucker head have equal pressure. Measure the other side of the machine in the same way. If your roller tension is anything other than 5.8 inches or 5 13/16, please consult the roller tension video to properly adjust the roller tension. To install the wrap flux coupler on the machine, rotate the roller so that the teeth of the coupler hubs align. Check to ensure that the two coupler hubs have horizontal alignment. If the hubs are misaligned, consult our coupler installation video for further details of how to fix this issue. Apply food-grade grease to the green coupler element before installation. Install the green element in the coupler. Align the two screw holes on the black ring with the green coupler element screw holes and slide the cover over. It's important to use the new screws included with the green coupler element ring. They have factory applied Loctite on them. Using a 2.5 millimeter hex wrench, snug down the screws on the coupler element ring. Using the two thumb screws, install the rear motor guard. Plug in the machine, turn the speed dial to 10, and listen for any odd noises as the machine runs for the first time. If she's running smoothly, you're ready to go back to harvest. Since you're living in the real world and you're not performing your roller swap in a perfect studio on a brand new machine, we highly suggest that you listen to the entire tips and tricks section to save yourself a whole lot of hassle. If you haven't maintained your machine properly, there's a decent chance that your shafts will be rusty and dinged up. Trying to remove a bearing from a rusty shaft is a guaranteed disaster. Your bearing will seize onto the shaft if you're not careful. The tolerances between the shaft and the bearing are very small. Any imperfections on the shaft will cause the bearing to seize up and lock onto the shaft while you're trying to slide it off if you're not careful. The important point here is, if the bearing's not sliding freely on the shaft while you're trying to remove it, stop and clean up the imperfections on the shaft before you continue. This will help you avoid seizing the bearing onto the shaft. If you simply sand the shaft down or file down imperfections, the job will be easy. The tools you will need to clean up your shafts include a Type A very fine Scotch-Brite pad, emery cloth, and a metal file. Make sure that you choose a metal file with a very fine pattern. The Scotch-Brite pad works well for light rust. The emery cloth works better for more stubborn rust. Your shaft should look brand new before you proceed with trying to remove the bearing from the shaft. Again, if the bearing hangs up at all, stop and continue dressing up the shaft before you try to remove the bearing. It's critical that you file down any dings in the shaft before you try to remove the bearing from the shaft. If the bearing ever hangs up on a ding and you try to proceed with removing the bearing from the shaft, it's a guaranteed way to make the bearing seize on there. If you simply push the bearing back onto the shaft and file the ding flat, the bearing will remove freely. Before you ever install a new bearing on an old shaft, you want to work very hard to make the shaft look as perfect as possible before sliding that new bearing on. Everything when it comes to sliding bearings onto shafts should happen very easily. If there's ever any challenges where you feel any resistance, you need to stop, dress up the shaft before you try to proceed. The initial move of getting a bearing onto a shaft can be a little bit tricky, but is easy as well if you're doing it right. Wiggle the bearing back and forth until you find the hole and slide on freely. Cut some strips of plywood of varying thicknesses from 1/4 inch to 3/4 inch. Round over the end of the piece of plywood to aid in inserting between the rollers. Use one hand to push the plywood in while turning the roller with the other hand to aid in feeding it between the rollers. This will force the rollers apart. You'll have to remove the first piece and insert a slightly thicker piece between the rollers. Wiggle the piece of plywood back and forth to continue separating the rollers. Force and wiggle.